Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. In the 18th century, European powers combed the South Seas, searching out unexplored lands, treasures, and people. British ships, commanded by celebrated navigators such as Captain James Cook, led the way. British sea power led to discoveries that would lay the foundations for its empire.
The strength of empire is conquest and credit.
You can't understand the history of the British Empire without understanding Britain's central role in slavery.
The British were a bunch of warmongers. The empire is based on money and based on violence, on the ability to kind of employ large numbers of troops to fight. Empire, in a sense, is a career. It's a line of work for a large section of Britain's elite.
At the heart of this great empire was India, a vast and exotic land, teeming with peoples, religions, and treasures. For almost 200 years, the British would be the world's major power, and its empire the largest the world had ever seen.
We became the world's first global superpower.
In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore 10 sites that made history and chart the rise and fall of the British Empire. The roots of British power can be traced here to the Caribbean, where the free labor of slaves imported from West Africa was used to harvest sugarcane, which European tastes craved as much, if not more, than other so-called Eastern delicacies, such as coffee, chocolate, tea, and spices.
In the Middle Ages, it was possible to obtain sugar in Europe. It was generally traded along the spice route. So it was grown mostly in the Indian subcontinent, and if you were a very wealthy or powerful European, you could probably afford enough sugar to put it on your table. It was a symbol of royalty and power, and it was also incredibly valuable. And so from the very beginning, the European colonization of the New World had a lot to do with transplanting sugar canes. And as the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, the value of sugar only increased. The transatlantic slave trade destroyed the lives of nearly 8 million enslaved Africans in the course of 300 years of slave trading. And that it provided labor to the sugar plantation colonies of the British Caribbean. And the sugar colonies were incredibly important to the expansion of the British Empire in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. Slave ships became, in a sense, machines for keeping people barely alive. If they brought, let's say, 280 enslaved people across the Atlantic, they would weigh the costs of keeping them barely alive in the hold, barely fed, against the cost of any of them dying on the course of the voyage. One of the most famous images associated with British anti-slavery is a drawing of the slave ship Brooks, which is sort of cut in cross-section and illustrated with all of the enslaved Africans who could fit in the hold, sort of lying head to toe, to give you a sense of the way that every single sort of cubic meter of space within the hold of a slave ship was calibrated such that it could contain the most human cargo. Sugar mills were everywhere, and they were a kind of technology that was common to all of the empires. Sugar mills were also the central icon of Caribbean slavery. If you're making sugar, you have a very short period of time between when you cut down the sugar cane and when it can be turned into the final raw, what it was often called muscovado sugar. You have probably something like 24 to 48 hours before the cane juice turns sour. Consequently, it was very, very important on Caribbean plantations that sugar canes make it to the mill quickly and that the sugar be boiled and subsequently processed and refined as quickly as possible before it's soured, which meant a spectacularly violent and spectacularly intense pace of work during what was called crop time in the Caribbean.
The cut sugarcane was brought to the mill by donkey or cart. Inside the mill, the enslaved workers fed the cane through rollers to crush it to extract the juice. The earliest mills, known as cattle mills, were powered by cattle or oxen. Windmills were then introduced. By 1764, there were more than 260 windmills on the island of Barbados alone. They worked faster than the animal mills, but were useless when the wind dropped, so some owners kept animal-powered mills. In the early 19th century, plantation owners began to invest in steam engines to power their mills. The engines could run continuously, but needed large amounts of fuel and water and were expensive to buy.
Also, working in the mill was one of the most dangerous tasks associated with slavery in the Caribbean. Enslaved people would be assigned to work in the sugar mill with machetes in order to effectively lop off the arms of people who got their arms stuck in the works of the sugar mill, partly to prevent the death of the person whose hand was caught in the sugar mill, but also in a sense to make sure that the production process didn't slow down.
Fort Rodney, here on the island of St. Lucia, is just one of a string of Caribbean forts built by European powers, including the British, as they fought to dominate the sugar and slave trades over a period of 200 years.
Admiral Rodney was actually able to see Martinique from the top of the fort, one of the most important French colonies in the Caribbean. It does say something about just how close together the islands of the Caribbean were and how hotly contested the possession of sugar islands was for all of the European powers, not just for Britain.
Britain's North American colonies were critical in supporting the sugar production effort on Britain's Caribbean islands.
Many of Britain's colonies in North America supplied the West Indies with products. The American colonies were initially considered to be places where undesirables were sent. From the perspective, though, of George III, who was king at the time of the American Revolution, the loss of the American colonies was something that he never really personally recovered from and never really forgave the United States of America for.
Through the early and mid-19th century, Britain has access to kind of global credit networks. None of its rivals have those kinds of connections. They can't borrow money in one place to spend in another in the same way. This is an empire of bankers. It's an empire of finance. It's about being able to ship money quickly from one place to another. That's the basis of imperial power.
Throughout the growth and development of empire, one British institution remained constant: the city and its access to money.
Some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Britain in the 18th century were people whose families had owned for generations sugar plantations in the West Indies. And with that economic power came political power.
But at the same time, one of the new British institutions was making its mark in another part of the world, Asia, and was soon responsible for half of the world's trade, mainly cotton and tea.
The East India Company has a really big role in the growth of empire, in spreading imperial institutions, and also, of course, in spreading British trade, too. It's an incredibly powerful organisation in the 18th century in particular, and I think it creates an idea of Britain as, you know, as a nation that goes everywhere, that is capable of having some kind of commercial and political role everywhere across Asia.
When Britain first set foot in India, she found a civilization older than the Greeks, with different customs, rituals, and religions. Then as now, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Muslims made up India's population. And despite their differences, they had found a common ruler in the Mughal emperors of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Islamic Mughal dynasties were from Central Asia and were renowned for their architecture, cuisine, and culture. Their most famous emperor was Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal in the city of Agra. The British arrived in India just as the Mughals reached the height of their power, and they came here purely to trade.
The East India Company is founded in 1600 with a royal charter from Elizabeth I, and it's a group of London merchants who are given the monopoly on British trade with Asia.
The East India Company were looking to trade not just in tea, but in gems, cloths, gunpowder and spices, which were mined and made in the Moluccas, China, and of course, India. To reach India, the London-based company dispatched ships following in the footsteps of the 15th century Portuguese explorers who first navigated around the Horn of Africa in pursuit of the Arab spice trail. It would prove a most profitable enterprise. In 1661, Charles II married Catherine of Braganza of Portugal, and her marriage dowry gave the English crown modern-day Mumbai. In Calcutta, it was the French and the Nawab rulers of Bengal who proved obstinate obstacles to British conquest. Enter a writing clerk of the East India Company, Robert Clive. He took command of the company's troops, and backed by regiments of Indian sepoys, he drove the French out of Pondicherry. Then, in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, he unseated the incumbent Nawab of Bengal and secured Calcutta for Britain.
Kew Gardens is part of the 18th century scientific and intellectual enlightenment. It's created in a period when clever men wanted to know how the world worked. They wanted to find out the extent of the natural world and the machinery, if you like, of the natural world. Discover plants, understand their nature. It was part of exploration.
British explorers and botanists such as Sir Joseph Banks were key in searching out plants which could be grown, traded and transplanted, furthering the fortunes of empire. These adventurers literally redistributed the world's crops, such as tea and later rubber, and in the process changed entire landscapes.
He was an imperialist through and through in every single sense of the word. He was interested in Britain ruling the whole world, basically. He was very close to George III. He had this very paternalistic vision that what was good for the mother country, for Britain, was also good for Britain's colonies.
Banks' role as a scientific advisor to government on global matters would lead him here to Kew Gardens, today the site of the Royal Botanical Gardens, established with great enthusiasm by England's King George III nearly 250 years ago.
Banks's hands were involved throughout government, all aspects of trade and science, and as the 18th century was a really important period of development for the empire, naturally enough he was really intimately involved, and he was described in fact as one of the most staunch imperialists of his age. He used to regularly come here to Kew every Saturday morning to meet the King during the summer when the King was in residence here. We'd go walking in the gardens and in the farmland for usually about 3 hours at a time, inspecting the new plants. Banks had a kind of vision about a self-sustaining empire where the colonies would produce raw materials that could then flow into Britain and be manufactured into goods for re-export. He was one of the first to think about kind of self-contained economy and to put it in an imperial context.
France had long been Britain's major imperial foe in Europe and beyond, as the major European powers searched out spheres of influence in a quest for global dominance. But Britain's victories in the Battle of Trafalgar under Nelson in 1804 and at the Battle of Waterloo, when troops commanded by the Duke of Wellington defeated the Grand Army of Napoleon, propelled British power and influence to a new level.
Britain is now supreme. The world is in its own hands. It can do what it likes. And we became the world's first global superpower.
Britain's victories in the Napoleonic Wars do propel Britain to become the dominant power in the 19th century. They deal a final blow to France as a kind of rival for imperial power.
Nelson's flagship, appropriately named Victory, is preserved in dock in the naval town of Portsmouth. HMS Victory cost the equivalent of $100 million to build. Life on board Nelson's ship was tough. You got 60 lashes for falling asleep on duty and 18 for filthiness. Victory had 104 guns, the maximum number for a warship of the time. 6,000 trees were used in its construction. 90% were oak. Victory exhibited a black and ochre colour scheme, later adopted by all Royal Navy ships. The Nelson checker was an adaptation of this scheme. It consisted of bands of black and yellow painted along the sides, broken up by black gun ports. Nelson apparently used the same style for all vessels under his command. It is suggested that the black gun ports were intended to make them appear opened, and so the ship would appear more intimidating from a distance. The actual spot where Nelson fell on the deck in the heat of battle has been identified. Having been told that the enemy fleet had been defeated, his last words were, "I have done my duty, I praise God for it." Nelson's statue stands atop Nelson's column in the appropriately named Trafalgar Square in the heart of London.
Wellington was a remarkably courageous man physically, a man of enormous presence and courage. Wellington was hands-on. Now, Wellington never commanded large formations to the extent Napoleon did. Napoleon's approach was much more like Nelson's. Band of brothers, let's sit down, let's talk about this. Wellington was very much a top-down, hands-on, shut it down, control freak. But you knew where you were with him. He took all responsibility onto himself. And the fact that he could do so and command such loyalty says a lot about him. He was known to be someone who didn't give up. He had a backbone of iron.
In fact, Wellington never lost a battle. Wellington's home at Hyde Park Corner in central London, a gift from the nation, displays the spoils of victory, the triumphs of both the man and the nation. This incredible Portuguese table service was presented to the Duke by a grateful Prince Regent of Portugal. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, a banquet would be held here for the great and the good, with the table service at its centre. On the walls of the state dining room, still here today, are giant portraits of the grateful European monarchs who lavished gifts on Wellington. Wellington's victory at Waterloo defined the rest of his life. In fact, the lower part of his giant funeral carriage, which weighs 18 tons, was actually constructed from guns captured at the battle. Like his great rival Napoleon's reburial in Paris, the Duke's funeral, when he died aged 84 in 1852, was one of the biggest public events of the 19th century. Wellington and Nelson to this day are probably Britain's greatest war heroes alongside Churchill. Both are buried here in St. Paul's Cathedral.
The prestige of Britain rose immeasurably. After Waterloo, there was a long period of peace in Europe.
Of Waterloo, Wellington had remarked, "It was the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Never was I so near to being beat." Ruling the waves, British ships spread out across the globe in search of new conquests.
I think it was sort of an accident that happened to bear fruit for the British Empire fairly quickly. If you could claim Australia, the French couldn't have it. After the loss of the American colonies, there was a kind of burst of, you would call it, I guess, creative energy amongst British imperial planners about new kinds of colonies.
Britain wasn't only involved in the transportation of plants and animals across the globe to further its global trading dominance. It also transported its own people to the New World, often forcibly, to grow its imperial ambitions. After the discovery of the east coast of Australia in 1770 by Captain Cook, British politicians decided to ship convicts, mainly an underclass of its own poor, petty criminals, to Australia, in part to head off rival French claims to the Great South Land. The great French explorer La Pérouse arrived just a week after the first fleet of convicts arrived in Sydney Harbour in January 1788. Over a period of just 60 years, 160,000 British and Irish were shipped forcibly to penal colonies in Australia.
Scourger, do your duty. 1, 2, 3.
All empires rely upon forced labour of one kind or another. The Ottoman Empire, kind of sort of the Middle Eastern empires of the sort of 16th, 17th century rely upon forms of enforced labour coming from North Africa, sometimes even coming from Europe. Forced labour is kind of is a general empire-wide story.
As the convict ships rounded the huge basalt cliffs of Cape Pillar in faraway Tasmania, they entered the pride of the British colonial prison system. Easy to police and hidden away from civilization, this was Port Arthur. Prison reformers back in Britain wanted to experiment with new forms of punishment. The centerpiece of the new institution was the model prison. Port Arthur was just one example of model prison experiments, which were emerging from Jeremy Bentham's theories of punishment and rehabilitation. The layout of these prisons would be fairly symmetrical. The prison wings were each connected to the surveillance core of the prison in the center of the structure. From this surveillance hub, each wing could be clearly seen. The essential elements of Bentham's design were not only that the custodians should be able to view the prisoners at all times, but also that the prisoners should be unable to see the custodians, and so could never be sure whether or not they were under surveillance. The model prison system signalled a shift from physical punishment to psychological punishment. From 1833 to 1853, Port Arthur was the destination for the most hardened British criminals, those who were secondary offenders, having re-offended after arrival in Australia. Rebellious personalities from other convict stations were also sent here. In 1831, the Empress Victoria came to the throne and inherited not just a vast Indian dominion, but soon an industrial revolution powered by coal and steam and forged with steel, all of which produced machines that improved efficiency and increased productivity. Britain then became the workshop of the world. It built mills with jennies that could spin imported cotton and re-export it as finished cloth.
The early Industrial Revolution is driven in particular by the attempt to compete with cloth being imported from the Indian subcontinent. And Britain just can't compete with this kind of cheap and really, really high quality cloth and clothes. And so it develops these kind of much more advanced mechanized processes that don't require the employment of so much labour. As you go forward into the 19th century, it's then the fact that Britain does have the most sophisticated textile industry, has a sophisticated armaments industry, etc., which kind of creates a basis for kind of imperial power.
Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, saw their role as cementing Britain's position as a global superpower.
Victoria and Albert had an idea of themselves as global imperial sovereigns. They had an idea that they wanted to compete in particular with other European empires. You had the German Empire, you had a kind of French state that kind of claimed to be an empire. You had, kind of Austria-Hungary and so forth. And you get this sense that they're kind of jealous of these other figures in Europe who use this word emperor. And so they both kind of, see sort of a global role actually as something that is going to put them on the European stage. And they have a kind of vision of an empire that looks in some ways much more like European empires, but is spread globally.
As we took over countries, we discovered they had systems which were hierarchical. Power flowed downwards. So it was very easy for, if you like, a sultan in Nigeria to understand that now above him was another monarch.
In a London almost drunk with the power wielded over the rest of the civilized world, Albert started involving himself in many public causes, and one of his biggest successes was the Great Exhibition of 1851. Housed in a giant crystal palace in Hyde Park in London, it was a showcase of British industry, ingenuity, and its global colonial possessions. After expenses, the exhibition had made a massive profit, and Albert purchased a great swathe of West London called South Kensington, on which was to be built educational and cultural institutions. The area became known as Albertopolis and included the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the Albert Hall. The Albert Hall opened in 1871 with a capacity of more than 5,000 people, is one of the United Kingdom's most treasured and distinctive buildings. The design was heavily influenced by ancient amphitheatres, but its most distinctive feature was its great glass and wrought iron roof. A trial assembly took place in Manchester before it was brought to London by horse and cart to be placed on the building.
Grandeur, pomp, ceremony, size. If they had any space to fill, they filled it with decoration and frilly bits. We went completely over the top in the 1800s, and the frieze is part of that. It was called the frieze of the arts and the sciences. And in fact, above the frieze, they've got a marvelous inscription that goes right round. Thine be the glory and the power and the victory and the whole thing. And then over on that side, and everything that is in heaven and earth is thine. And it goes on and on and on, extolling the virtues, really, of England and its magnificent empire. The whole thing could be paraphrased as to the glory of the empire, England, Albert, and me, Victoria. That's what it's about, really. This is the Albert Memorial. Poor Albert died age 42, and Queen Victoria was absolutely devastated. Within a year, they'd started construction of this amazing memorial to him. It took 10 years to build, and then another 3 years to get his statue there, done in 24-karat gold. And he's holding not so much the Bible, which is what people think, but in fact he's holding the catalogue to his great exhibition, which had taken place 10 years before in the park behind him. And the whole thing is designed to show Albert in his role as the promoter of industry, of art, of science. The best thing really is in the detail, not just the white frieze at the bottom, but moving up to near the top. They've got these angels, all looking very tragic, with their hands down to receive Albert's soul. And right at the top, just below the cross, they've got their angels with their hands outstretched, ensuring that Albert's soul goes up to God, to the cross, right on the top. The whole thing really is very extravagant, religious, Albert, God, all in the same package. And then round the outside, you've got the 4 continents. And the front here, of course, you've got Europe and Asia. And at the back, you've got Africa and America.
It was during the Indian cotton boom that colonial Bombay, dazzling with British architectural details of the day, showed its brilliant face. The straight line and uniform streets of the so-called Heritage Mile are clear to see. The British wanted to make the area as close as possible to Victorian London. Of the many buildings built by the British in Bombay, there's none more iconic than Victoria Terminus, now called CST Station. Completed in 1888, it took 10 years to build at a cost of £260,000. At the time, the most expensive building in Asia. It's now the second most photographed building in India after the Taj Mahal. Victoria Station was constructed in the high Victorian Gothic Revival style. Its C-shaped plan provided a symmetry at its east and west ends. Its skyline, turrets and pointed arches were also similar to classic Indian palace architecture, which made it acceptable to both British and Indian cultures. The building was crowned by a high central dome, which acts as a focal point. On top of the dome is a colossal female figure, symbolizing progress, holding a torch pointing upwards in her right hand and a spoked wheel in her left. The side wings are anchored by monumental turrets at each of their 4 corners, which balances the frame of the central dome.
It was inspired primarily by London's St. Pancras station. In Bombay, unlike the rest of India, relations between the British and the locals were very different. Here they coexisted peacefully, they liked each other. If you see the entryway, you've got a lion on the left side and you've got a tiger on the right. So it symbolizes the fact that the British wanted to imply to the locals that this is as much ours as it is yours. This is one of the busiest stations in India. Today, there isn't a single square inch of the country that isn't connected through the rail network. And that was probably the greatest legacy that the British left behind.
In the kind of second half of the 19th century in particular, Britain consolidated its position as a global superpower, if you like, through building railways, through laying down these sort of like iron lines on the ground that it wished to dominate, to control. They're often not about trade. Their railways are not always about kind of sort of access to markets and so forth. They're about being able to move the instruments of government, often armies even, from one place to another very, very quickly. And they're kind of symbolic as well. They're a symbol of power. You've got these kind of this physical articulation, if you like, of imperial sovereignty kind of sort of etched onto the kind of the ground.
But even before the completion of this vast rail network, signs of discontent in Britain's greatest colony was growing. Lucknow is known for these magnificent ruins called the Residency, built in 1667 by traders of the East India Company. It became home to the British Commissioner in 1857. Indian soldiers seized the Residency after a series of grievances, including the insistence by their British officers that they use pig fat to stoke their rifle ammunition, which both Hindu and Muslim soldiers objected to on religious grounds. The mutiny lasted 80 days and more than 250 people were killed. After the mutiny was broken, British power was restored.
Interestingly, there's a decision made to leave it as a ruin, and it's still a ruin now. The British have been based in Lucknow. It's blown to pieces in the course of the 1857 rebellion, and rather than kind of sort of putting some kind of monument on top or building a great hotel, it's left as it is, and that becomes a really important sort of ghoulish site. And you have photographs quite quickly afterwards of the site of the Residency with lots of kind of bones and skulls at the front of it. I think they'll probably put there afterwards, in fact. And that's the postcard that gets sent around, by people visiting, kind of back home, etc. The British, constantly kind of affirm, if you like, the importance of empire. They need to kind of keep hold of this empire because otherwise they'll let the people who killed their relatives and their ancestors kind of sort of win. And it's a way of sort of almost keeping the resentment alive, I guess.
Despite growing discontent in India, elsewhere in the world, at the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire seemed in rude health.
Britain makes things that people want. Bicycles, telephones, telegraph systems, and motor cars. So we are a powerhouse of manufacturing, and manufacturing goods that people want. Britain's Industrial Revolution comes first. Britain had the largest fleet in the world. It also had a series of strategically placed bases. Gibraltar and Malta control the Mediterranean. Halifax, Bermuda, the North Atlantic, even the Falkland Islands, the route between the Atlantic and the Pacific, not very much used. Cape Town controls the sea, Indian Ocean on one side and the South Atlantic on the other. Aden controls part of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Hong Kong, Singapore, the China Seas, and Sydney in Australia, the South Pacific Naval Base. You have these bases, which are like nails driven into the globe. You can't move by sea without going past one of them or two of them. And it gives you enormous power. It means you can move soldiers where you like. The telegraph is often forgotten in the history of the empire, but it was extremely important. It's important to the steamship. It communicated between the metropolis, the centre, and the outlying areas, and brought them under close control. And also, if you had a crisis, you could summon up help very quickly.
As British politicians, businessmen and adventurers travelled the world, administering and trading with their empire at the dawn of the 20th century, it wasn't surprising that they developed new forms of transportation and lifestyles getting them there. The five-star hotel was basically a British invention.
These hotels are really important. They're not just places where people go and stay. They're meeting places where negotiations happen, where deals are made. They're sort of hubs of communication, business centres in a way that is, it's crucially important.
When Europeans went out to trade with the world and to govern it, they tended to cling together. President Nixon once sourly remarked that the first thing the British do in their colonies is to establish a club and make sure only white men attend it.
Because these places tend to be white only, because it's mainly, kind of Europeans who are there, and many of them, local capitalists, business people, leaders kind of sort of feel excluded and then create rival hotels. The classic instance of this, of course, is the Taj in Mumbai, which was created in the early 20th century as a place where Indians could meet, where they weren't going to have the British officials kind of spying on them. It's where the Indian princes would have all their meetings. So it becomes a safe space for the indigenous elite.
Raffles Hotel in Singapore was run by the famous Armenian Sarkis brothers, who arranged for their guests to be picked up at the docks and brought to the hotel, where they were treated to hitherto unknown creature comforts, such as electrical light, heating and beverages, including exotic alcoholic drinks and a British invention, high tea. Such was the success of Raffles that the Sarkis opened more hotels in Britain's Asian rubber and spice colonies. Among them, the E&O in Penang, Malaysia, and the Strand in Rangoon in Burma. The Sarkis unfortunately went bankrupt, but their hotels are still here today. The jewel in the crown of the empire had always been India. In New Delhi, its planned capital, architect Sir Edward Lutyens, the greatest British architect of his age, found an expression for an imperialism which mined the resources and talents of occupied India with his own architectural vision. Rashtrapati Bhavan is now the official home of the President of India and one of the largest residences of a head of state in the world. Lutyens travelled between India and England almost every year for 20 years to work on the construction of the Viceroy's palace in both countries. His design is grandly classical overall, and he's known to have stated that the domes were inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, but under pressure he was forced to incorporate Hindu and Muslim architectural elements in the building. To the east is the colossal Jaipur column, erected by Lutyens to commemorate the transfer of India's capital from Calcutta to Delhi in 1911. The whole structure includes 700 million bricks and 3.5 million cubic feet of stone, with only minimal usage of steel. The Mughal garden, situated at the back of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, incorporates Mughal and English landscape styles. The Viceroy's palace demonstrated perfectly the fusion of the occupied and the occupier. Ironically, it was in New Delhi, just a few years after the construction of this magnificent building, that the first cracks in the edifice of empire would appear. The protest movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi, would eventually lead to the British leaving India, Indian independence, and a long period of slow decline of British influence around the world, which would gather pace.
The buildings and monuments left behind by the British in India reflect the desire by the British in India to assert how important India is to their country and how important the British Empire is to India. But in many ways, they're ways of trying to assuage the anxiety of this tiny group of Britons compared to the overall Indian population, kind of governing a society in a very unstable, often chaotic way. The British Empire in India is actually quite unstable. It's constantly facing rebellion. It's constantly verging on the edge of bankruptcy. And so building is a way in which the British persuade themselves and their public that it's stable, it's strong, it's something that has authority. And we look at Delhi, the capital of British India, built in the 1920s and 1930s. You look at those buildings and you think, this is the kind of splendid mark of a triumphant Britain. In fact, of course, Delhi was built at the time when the British Empire was under crisis, and it was built in a city that was empty. It was built in a city which didn't have a large population at the time, which was seen as a decayed former capital. The early photographs of the kind of Lutyens' Delhi from the air, you see what it is, which is this strange folly.
There were many instrumental statesmen and politicians pushing for independence after the Second World War, none more so than Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi travelled across India, listening to the grievances of the peasants in order to present his case for India's economic independence. They gathered here at India's Imperial Hotel to discuss the situation.
The stone is the same, the pillars are the same, the glass, the walls, everything is exactly the way it was 80 years ago. The freedom fighters would come to this very terrace and sit down and have meetings and discussions regarding the policy and the plan of the transfer of the power from the British government to Indian government. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the first leaders, the big leaders, who ultimately became the first Prime Minister. And then Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, he's also known as the Iron Man of India. And then we had Lord Mountbatten, who of course was the last Viceroy of India.
Gandhi tried to persuade the Muslim League's leader, Mohammed Jinnah, not to set up a separate Muslim state, but ultimately he failed. Gandhi's legacy as the father of independence lives on in places like his house in Mumbai, which today is a museum.
For him, the belief was that a true leader would be somebody who would not only be identified with the people who he led, but would make himself or herself be even weaker or poorer than the people he attempted to lead, because he thought that that was the only way that he could gain their confidence and their belief in his honesty. If he had to cripple the British textile industry, he had to revive the ancient art of spinning and weaving. And so he adopted these spinning wheels and he started learning to spin. He turned it into a kind of a religion for people to defeat what he called the monster of industrialization. He asked people to discard whatever foreign goods they had. It was in Bombay that first of the bonfires of British goods was lit. Almost 75% of the population joined into the movement. The spirit was unconquerable, and that's what defeated the British in the end.
Gandhi would pay for Indian independence in 1948 when he was assassinated by a Muslim extremist. Today, Gandhi's memorial lies in the heart of New Delhi.
Mahatma Gandhi, to me, to my family and to India, he means father of the nation. He means the most powerful person who led India to independence through peaceful methods.
It's unbelievable to think that the British Raj came crashing down just 16 years after the creation of New Delhi. At the Coronation Memorial, statues of toppled viceroys stand abandoned, stark emblems of India's colonial past. Some of the statues are half wrapped in garbage bags. Others have their inscriptions chopped out. How symbolic of the fall from grace which marked the end of Britain's imperial dream.
Ultimately, the British Empire collapses because the British hugely overestimate their power, and they imagine that they have control where they don't. They imagine they can get things done without negotiating, without collaborating when they can't. And that creates kind of cycles of resistance and opposition that eventually lead to kind of collapse. And of course creates a space for other powers, the United States, etc., to emerge. And I think that's a kind of, in a way, maybe that's a universal human story. There's a kind of, seems to be a, imperial hubris seems to be everywhere, that, kind of political leaders forget the fragile basis of their authority in any case, and kind of overstep the mark and try and expand and get too confident, and that leads to their downfall. And empires always rise and they always fall, and that seems continually to be the case.
The British Empire was very, very good for white settlers. It was very, very good for a relatively small group of very powerful and well-connected Britons in Britain proper. It was very good for the people who were able to benefit from the global reach and economic power of the British Empire. It was very bad for, millions of enslaved Africans. It was very bad for indigenous peoples in Britain's settler empire who were dispossessed of and then alienated from their land.
The British resisted Malaya, put down a native uprising, Mau Mau in Kenya. The Americans say this is fair enough. But what you are doing is pushing many of these colonial nationalist movements towards the communists. We don't want that. Therefore, grant independence as fast as you can. And British stretched for money, very much dependent upon American credit, are forced to acknowledge this. And so virtually by 1970 it's all gone. And what replaced it, of course, is another story.